Thanks for coming out on a dark, wet, cold, rainy night. Tonight we have historian extraordinaire, Tom Keller, who's been here before. And he's going to talk tonight about early New England country stores. And the presentation is supported by a grant from the Leicester Arts Council, a local agency supported by the Massachusetts Cultural Council. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for having me out, everybody. Is it okay if I sit? I figure it's a small room, and this way I don't run the risk of wandering into the screen. So I'm not blocking the screen now, right? If I turn around, I'm like, okay, good, wonderful. So, most of us, since we were very young, had the vocabulary of a general store. I usually don't have to describe what a general store or a country store is to most people. A lot of people have been to these New England country stores, which still proudly use the honorific general store, probably to drive visitation and shoppers. But of course, it's also something that has been romanticized and celebrated in song, story, and folk art through the centuries. Of course, it's a town gathering place, especially for people that apparently don't have anything to do. I mean the dog, of course, not the gentleman. And even today, throughout the country, you've got people promoting it. You are here, great, yeah. So, but it's on Route 66, so there we go. So what do you call it, a country store or a general store? It depends. The phrase general store doesn't get coined until the mid-1830s, and that in Virginia. We don't have the phrase general store much in New England until after the Civil War. So mid-1860s beyond. Before that, most New Englanders called it a country store. They also called it other things as well. A lot of times they just call it by the name of the proprietor, Johnson's or Johnson's store, that kind of thing. But also there were dry goods stores, since they don't tend to sell fresh groceries, because most of the country in the 18th, 19th century were rural. And you don't go to a storekeeper to get stale old stuff when you get the fresh stuff from your neighbors who are growing it and not have to pay a profit to a storekeeper. So they often sold dry goods, sometimes grocery stores. A lot of times they were, especially early on, were called West India goods stores, because what you needed to buy in the countryside initially was stuff that wasn't produced around here. West Indies is the Caribbean. So it was mostly sugar and things made from sugar, like rum, which was a very popular commodity among early New Englanders. So very often it went by one of these names. But until after the Civil War, most rural emporia were called country stores, because that's where they were, in the country, which was different than going to a urban center like Boston, port cities, Providence, etc., where you could find specialty shops that specialized in one thing or another. But these rural stores didn't have the luxury of specializing in one thing or another, so they tended to sell a variety of goods that the locals wanted. We'll get into what they wanted. In the colonial New England, in the 1700s, most people had a very different mindset about money and living their lives than most of us 21st century very much consumers do. In early New England, early America, most people hoped for what they called a competency. A competency was enough so that you and your family could live relatively comfortably. You expected to work for a living, because that's what people that weren't the royalty or the aristocracy did, or a few professions did, was worked with your hands. And even a lot of the professionals, the lawyers, the ministers, also farmed part of the time. But most people hoped for what they called a competency was enough so that they could live with reasonable comfort and enough of a cushion. So if you got sick, if you got hurt, if you were lucky enough to get old. Remember, before the later 19th century, 1 in 5 children born, one never sees their first birthday, and only one sees their 65th birthday. Right, wow, because many of us, I at least am over 65. Yay! And I'm not one of the 1 in 5 in 1958 that has made it to this. So Anyway, the point is that a competency was enough to get by, enough to provide for your children, so they could have a reasonable start in life. Most people that have children want to at least, not just raise them and then, okay, you're 18, out the door, don't call me anymore until I need you. No, people try to help their children out in life, help them with college, help them with trade school, help them buy a house, whatever you can afford to provide for. But that's what people, by and large, hoped for, was a competency. Food in your bellies, a roof over your head, clothes on your back, and enough to take care of your family and yourself, but not grand luxury, no trips to Aruba or things like that a lot of 21st century people see as necessities. And that's consumerism. In the very late 1700s, after the American Revolution, you start to have a marked increase in overall wealth in this country. There's a lot of explanations for it. I'm not going to get into a lot of it. One of the initial things was that after the American Revolution, it sparked a wave of revolutions across Europe and the European world that America became part of when it got colonized by Europeans. And that made a lot of economic opportunity for New Englanders and Americans in general, selling foodstuffs and selling other goods to people that were too busy fighting wars to grow their own food, make their own stuff. Wars are expensive. And so that was the initial start of getting more and more revenue. And people started getting beyond that idea of a competency and saying, well, it'd be nice if I had what this rich person has. It'd be nice if I could have what the wealthier have. And so that's when you start getting this envious consumerism. A professor emeritus at Columbia University now, Richard Bushman, about 25, 30 years ago, wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called The Refinement of America. And his basic thesis was, in this late early 1800 period, you find most people feeling that the luxuries of the rich were something they could afford and increasingly became necessities of life. Tea, coffee, sugar for your tea and coffee, a nice set of English-made ceramics to make and serve your tea and coffee in, spoons to stir your coffee, a table setting for everybody in the family. Instead of put a bowl in the middle, everybody scoop it in, maybe get a bowl and a little wooden thing I carved with a jackknife. See where I'm going with this? We're becoming a nation of consumers. More and more, not just what you and your neighbors can make in exchange for balancing, sharing work, or trading work, as they called it, but increasingly buying things in a market from people made by people you don't know, and you making things for people you're never going to meet. It's the basic of the consumerism I'm going to get into. Anyway, I'm just going to show some country stores. I couldn't easily find some pictures of country stores in Leicester. I mean, just driving here, I was thinking probably the Ruse Market at one time was a country store. Maybe you know. It certainly looks like it had the makings of one at one time. Anyway, but anyhow, just some around this part of New England. This little country store in Fiskdale, that one in Shrewsbury. Of course, this one in the, well, I can't read what it says, La Flemme country store in Fiskdale. I love the little streetcar going by. And this one in Greenwich, which is now under the Quabbin Reservoir. Of course, they burned this building down before they built the Quabbin. There are no buildings under the Quabbin, but certainly the land it's on, where Mr. Hall, proudly standing in front, had his emporium. So country stores played a lot of roles. They were very often community centers, like those gentlemen around the potbelly stove in that other romantic picture. But oftentimes there were post offices. Back in early America, America in 1800 had several times over the biggest post office in the world. We were far from the biggest or most populous country in the world, either geography or population. But we had a post office that was several times bigger than England's, several times bigger than France's. And we were growing. The post office was increasingly, every town felt they needed a post office. but the government didn't build them. The big government building of post offices came in the 1930s when FDR's Work Progress Administration tried to think of ways to employ Americans by coming up with jobs. And they didn't want to just give people money, but give people work to earn money. And that's where we got a lot of our first publicly built post offices. And this idea that the government should build a post office for us, gosh darn it. But early on, for a lot of American history, the post office was where the postmaster was. The postmaster was appointed by the Postmaster General in Washington. Back then, the Postmaster General was a cabinet level position. The only person in the federal government who made more money than the Postmaster General was the President of the United States. And so it was an important, it was in the succession of the presidency. So the Postmaster General appointed local postmasters, and you needed two things to be a postmaster. You could be a postmistress, especially if your husband had been a postmaster and been doing a good job and he died. So they did let women do it sometimes. But basically, postmasters had to have political connections so that the Postmaster General in Washington, who the president would say, you know, I got a constituent and blah, blah. But also, you needed to have a public-facing business. And for a lot of people, that was a store. The other public-facing business what we're in was a tavern. So tavern keepers and storekeepers tended to be the postmasters in most towns. And the post office was in their business. So that's how it worked. Mail wasn't delivered to your house. It came to the post office. If you thought you had mail, you went to the proprietor and said, is there a letter for me? Like you can see this gentleman here and this lady saying, is there a letter for me? And he's looking at it to see if it's for her. But she wants it, give it to me. Anyway, but this isn't about the postage as much as the role of storekeepers very often as the post office in town and places where people gathered, including in the evening. Some gentlemen would hang about. You also had stores that came to you. This isn't mostly about peddlers, but I can't talk about this idea of increasingly buying and selling and consumerism without stores that come to you. Of course, nowadays, the store comes to us through Amazon or some other online thing where at 3 in the morning we're bored, we can't sleep, and we're scrolling, we buy things with a click of a button that we really don't need. See the coat behind me? I didn't need that, but it looked good online a couple months ago. Anyway, the point is that back then, a lot of usually young men, sometimes older, but a lot of times young men who couldn't afford the real estate and the capital to stock a store would take $50, $100, buy whatever they could carry and walk around the countryside and bring it to people. Because it was a lot less mobile society than we have today. What makes Amazon and its brethren and so popular is our transportation system, where UPS and other delivery services can bring this stuff to us easily and cheaply. Back then, there was about 1 horse for every 10 people. It wasn't like in the movies where everybody gets a horse when they turn 4. Horses then as now are expensive, and a lot of people couldn't afford them. So half the families might have a horse, and a horse on a dirt road doesn't go nearly as far or as fast or as easily as an automobile on our paved roads, even when the traffic backs up. So stores that came to you. In Oxford, just a few towns south of here, in 1828, a correspondent for the Southbridge Register newspaper counted 26 peddlers that came through town in 10 days and carefully described each one of them and what they were selling. One was selling washing machines, big wooden tub. There, you don't plug them in. So a big wooden tub with a crank on it that turns an agitator that agitates your clothes. But that's what he was selling. And you got this guy here, which is a little stylized, selling a coffee grinder and other people. And you can see he's got a clock inside. Some sold clocks. A lot of things were peddled door to door by traveling salesmen. And there was a very good book. If you ever want to read a humorous book from the 1830s, there was a Canadian named Thomas Halliburton who wrote a series of novels. The first one was really a collection of short stories about a guy called Samuel Slick of Slicksville, Connecticut, who was a Yankee peddler. He puts them in dialect and everything, but well worth a read. Thomas Halliburton's Sam Slick of Slicksville, Connecticut. I think the title is The Yankee Peddler. Anyway, and of course they're the bane of the storekeepers because, well, like I said, some peddlers sold everything and some just sold a few things and were pestered by children. They were carrying a lot. A lot of storekeepers saw them, as they do street vendors now, as unfair competition because they're not paying real estate taxes, they're not paying insurance, they're not paying all the things that the storekeepers today have to pay for. And so storekeepers then really resented peddlers, and by the 1830s, 40s, they're increasingly lobbying their states and their towns to pass ordinances either against peddlers, to regulate peddlers, to make them get a license, which is a way to slow them down because they don't have time to wait for a license, pay for a license in every town. And so then as now, storekeepers don't like the people that are just not paying the taxes and the insurance, and they see as unfair competition and might not be there the next day. So if your watch that you got a good deal on isn't really a Rolex, they can't come back the next day and go, hey, like a storekeeper does. So anyway, the country store is something that by the late early 1800s, you start to find in most communities in rural New England. So part of that growing early flickers of consumerism I talked about earlier. And they do have thousands of things from all over the world. They're usually not selling things produced locally, of course, because why make a storekeeper get a profit if you can get it locally? Sometimes that goes on, but not usually. Now, this is not how a store looked. This is an illustration from a kid's textbook, as you can see, Emma Willard's Geography for Beginners, published in Hartford in 1826. But it's a cartoon, if you will, to show the school children where all the goods in their country store is coming from. And literally all over the planet. Some things are manufactured, but a lot of things are just not grown around here, like a lot of the spices, like tea, like cane sugar, and molasses, which is just cane sugar that wouldn't crystallize, and liquors, of course, Holland gin and Jamaican rum, and Malaga wine and Madeira wine, and port wine from Portugal, anyway. And all kind of other things that we just don't make around here. Best Havana cigars and all kinds of oranges and lemons and figs and other good stuff. So these country stores are increasingly bringing the world to rural people in a way that hadn't been available to them before. In colonial America, you did have what they usually called at the time country traders. Or sometimes merchants, but usually they were called traders, who bought a few basic necessities, if you will, or minor luxuries. They would usually have a handful of things, maybe some sugar or molasses or tea, or a few other local things you couldn't get locally. But increasingly, they started carrying more and more stuff. This is a museum exhibit, Old Sturbridge Village, but a lot of country stores say, well, this is actually a one-room store that was built in Dummerston, Vermont in 1811 by a storekeeper named Asa Black, who carried increasingly more and more things than those few necessities that a country trader might have. And the trader usually wasn't a full-time storekeeper. He was usually somebody who had some money to invest, oftentimes a more prosperous farmer, and that old saying goes, you need money to make money. So the people that had money would often be able to make a trip to Boston every once in a while and buy a few things from a port and bring it back to their rural area and sell it at a profit to the neighbors for things they just couldn't get locally. So increasingly that is the growth of stores. So I probably have gone enough into that beginning and expansion of country stores. So I'll talk about a few of the things that by the early 1800s, most country storekeepers were increasingly stocking. One was tools. Of course, in colonial America, a lot of your tools you made yourself, or a neighbor made, a cabinet maker maybe made parts for a plow or wooden rakes. Your blacksmith made axes and a few other tools for you. Some were imported increasingly by the mid-1700s. The English Midlands, the Black Country along the middle of England, towns in England like Sheffield, Dudley, Stourbridge, Birmingham, Sheffield, were increasingly paying very skilled men, and sometimes women, to make the same thing over and over and over again. And those people got very good at making that same thing, knives, saws, whatever, over and over again. But the way that English society was set up, if they worked hard all day and didn't get sick, they made enough to feed themselves and their families. They weren't highly paid craftsmen. England, Europe in general, tends to have more people historically than it has work for them. And so wages tend to be low. Here in America, when Europeans colonize, we tend to have the exact opposite. We tend to have more work that we could put people to than people to do it, which is why early on Europeans started enslaving indigenous people and kidnapping Africans and bringing them to the Americas, because there was more work than there were people to do it. And that tended to make wages for people that weren't enslaved to be higher here in the Americas than it was in Europe, which is an incentive to bring Europeans to America, as it is today. I don't have to tell you, no big shock, to bring people from Asia, Central America, South America, to the United States, because we have higher wages and more work to do than we have Americans willing to do it, or willing or able to do it. But anyway, the point is, increasingly storekeepers are bringing in things of higher quality, because you've got highly skilled tradesmen who aren't making a lot of money. And with ocean transportation and river transportation being fairly affordable, increasingly stores are carrying a variety of specialty made tools of higher quality, and people get out of the habit of having their neighborhood jack of all trades, master of none neighbors make clunky tools for them, and get used to having better quality tools for more affordably. And maybe their local blacksmith fixes their axe, but he doesn't make it anymore. Maybe he fixes your plow, but he doesn't make it anymore. So increasingly, country stores are carrying an ever wider variety of farm tools, woodworking tools, and other tools that people needed. And increasingly, they're carrying hardware. A lot of things by the late 1700s, early 1800s that for thousands and thousands of years had to be made by hand were being made by machine. Nails, for example, like in the lower left there. Those are what are called cut nails. In the 1790s, they developed machines that could take a bar of iron and just slice off cold little triangles of metal, and you got a nail. And by the 1820s, the machine then takes that little thin triangular sliver of metal, grabs it, and boom, a hammer smashes cold, not hot, heated up, smashes a rudimentary head on it. And so you don't have to have people making nails by hand anymore. That doesn't mean when they come up with machines, nobody makes nails by hand anymore, but it means that more and more people can get cheaper nails made by machine than made by hand. Not to make this a lesson in English history and economics, but there were still people that could make a living making nails by hand in the English Midlands into the 1950s. There are certain advantages of having things made by hand. You can get small batches of specialty goods made affordably. I had, at a job I had earlier in my life, I had necessity of specialized bolts. And this hardware stores didn't stock them. But I could go to one of the many machine shops in southern Worcester County and have them make these specialty bolts for me that I needed to, let me earn my living. So while they're using machines to do it, they're not tooled up like, General Motors to crank out 10 million of these things. But anyway, increasingly country stores are selling hardware. cast iron hinges, like you see here, butt hinges, and the screws to attach those hinges, rather than the handmade nails that you then deaden, clench over to hold in place like the old hinges that blacksmiths used to make. And increasingly these things are coming manufactured, especially from Britain, and being packaged up and sent over very often, because especially in a lot of the rest of the United States and certainly in a lot of Europe, not everybody can read and write. So a lot of times, you can't really see it here, but in the middle, a lot of things, those little boxes have one of whatever's in the box sort of tied to the string on top that holds the box together. So you can see it's buttons, it's nails, what they look like, it's screws, it's a hinge, what have you, even though there are dozens inside. Paintbrushes and all kinds of hardware increasingly became carried. Country stores carried more and more consumables. As I mentioned, in colonial times, traders would sometimes have some molasses, some sugar, some liquor, a few other things. The thing in the top middle there is actually a salted codfish. You probably wouldn't get that. We have those at Old Sturbridge Village. We don't, of course, fish for cod. We actually usually work out a deal with Mystic Seaport Museum. You know, we trade them something we make, redware pottery or ham or something like that, and they trade us their salted codfish. We demonstrate making the pots, they demonstrate flaking and salting the fish. Everybody's happy at both museums, except the person that puts the salted codfish in their trunk at Mystic to bring it up here in summer, and your car stinks like salted fish for a couple weeks. Anyway, the thing below this codfish is tobacco in its various forms, which was a big addiction in early America. My staff at Old Sturbridge Village sometimes asked me, did ladies smoke tobacco? I said, no. They said, did ladies chew tobacco? I said, oh, no. Like, women chew tobacco, women smoke tobacco, but ladies didn't. So, anyway, but men and women would very often chew, smoke, or snort tobacco, snuff, ground powdered tobacco, because, of course, nicotine is a highly addictive chemical. It's also a mild anesthetic. When you had poor dental care, chewing tobacco also somewhat relieved dental pain. But anyway, increasingly all kinds of things that people either needed or wanted were being dispensed by country stores. One thing you'll notice by this gentleman here is that most of the goods were shipped in bulk. They're not prepackaged. So the thing on the lower left is tea. Another difference in these country stores that I may as well mention now, I might mention it later if I forget that it's later in the slideshow, I don't remember for sure, is one difference you see in these early stores from what you and I are used to, is you don't have brands. We got tea. We got green tea and black tea, but we don't have Twinings, Bigelows, you know, the 10,000 Liptons, Red Rose, all the other brands of tea, coffee, sugar, you don't have brands. I got sugar, I got rum, see, done. That's what they got. So you don't have the brand competition that we have today. And so a lot of the goods were shipped in bulk. Barrels are a big common thing for dry goods, flour, nails, all kind of things were shipped in barrels. Because if you think about it, a barrel is a box and a wheel that had a baby. So it's real common for things to be shipped in barrels. You can put a couple 100 pounds in a barrel and just have one person roll it and steer it where you need it to go, and then rock it and tip it up on end so it doesn't roll anymore. So that's how most goods were shipped, and most goods were sold in bulk. So if you wanted to buy a quart of rum, a gallon of molasses, he'd be more than happy to sell it to you. How are you going to bring it home? This is not a good method. So usually you would either bring a container, or he would sell you a container. And you can see on the floor next to the storekeeper here, and on the shelf behind him, he has these thick green bottles. They call those junk bottles. They were not junk. They had value, but they weren't fine glassware. They're just very practical containers that could be very thoroughly washed, because glass is impervious to liquids. And so he would sell you a junk bottle if you didn't have a way of getting your rum home. He'd sell you a junk bottle. You bring it back all clean next time, he'd buy it back from you. You didn't want to bring it back to them? Fine, you already bought it from them. You use it for something around your house. So increasingly, you didn't tend to have everything pre-packaged. Some things were increasingly sold that way, but most goods were sold in bulk and not with individual brands. And like I said, he would sell you not only junk bottles, but increasingly they would carry nicer stuff. Part of that refinement of America that Richard Bushman described that I mentioned, the idea that I don't just have to eat off wooden plates that we carved ourselves. We don't have to have communal bowls in the middle we all scoop from. We can have our own plates and nice English ceramics that look like even nicer Chinese and Japanese ceramics. Glassware imported from Europe, but also increasingly glassware made in places like Coventry, Connecticut, and Sandwich, Massachusetts, that were not just the junk bottles, but more decorative and nicer, things that we wouldn't just dispose of, but use over and over and over again until they did break, or we decided to have even nicer things for our house than what we had before, and maybe let the children, when they move out, have the old ones. Not that that ever happens today. Stores often would carry books and stationery. One of the problems with early America, which I'll get into a little later, it was a very cash-poor society. I don't get into a lot of that now because I will get into it later, but there wasn't a lot of hold-in-your-hand money. And so a lot of makers of goods, like printers, were paid by the people that paid them to print the books, not just in money, but by getting to keep some of the books with the understanding that, okay, now you have to sell it. And that's how you get your money. And so a lot of times, printers would find rural stores in their region that would take some of the textbooks they may have had a contract to print, or some of the law books or other books that they had a contract to print. They also would very often, country stores would not only sell that, but blank books. Because it was a cash-poor economy, most people had to write down what other people owed them on paper. And it was easier, rather than have a little slip of paper that might get lost, have that paper bound into a blank book that you make into a journal or a ledger. Journal is more of a daily entry. It's from the French word jour, day. That's what a journal is a daily book. Then you had ledgers and account books for more long-term. But also increasingly, this being the most literate part of the country and one of the most literate parts of the planet Earth 200 years ago, New Englanders increasingly had an appetite for reading, not just for edification, not just textbooks, not just religious tracts, but increasingly for entertainment, novels and such like that. Most popular novels in the English-speaking world, including here in the early 1800s, were Sir Walter Scott's, what they call the Waverley novels, things Ivanhoe and those kind of works of fiction. I have to share you a terrible joke I heard over the weekend. Charles Dickens walks into a bar. He orders a martini. Bartender goes, Oliver Twist. Okay, I'll let that sink in. Before you throw things at me, I'll move on. Increasingly, country stores are selling shoes. Massachusetts was a huge manufacturer of shoes in the 19th century, even in the early 19th century before shoemaking was mechanized, when it was all done by hand, but they had a division of labor. And so storekeepers increasingly sold ready-made shoes, so people were buying shoes off the shelf in their size rather than having a shoemaker make it for them. Because of this division of labor and mass production, you could have better quality goods at lower prices, just like the tools, and increasingly other ready-made clothes like hats and mittens and gloves that are not as easy to make for yourselves sometimes were increasingly popular and sold through country stores. They also sold increasingly with this idea of consumerism. They had more and more luxuries, or what they called fancy goods. The costume jewelry, little sewing scissors, needles, pins, thimbles, hair combs, brass beads, chatelaines for carrying the sewing goods on your belt, and spectacles. There was no optometry back then. Basically, country stores increasingly carried what today we would call cheaters that you'd get at Walmart in the drugstore section of Walmart. You know, and if you get presbyopia, as I do, you know, you when your eyes get old and don't focus anymore, you try on different ones until you can read pretty well again. And you go, oh my gosh, it's wonderful. I should have done this a year ago, but I'm stubborn. Anyway, notice I'm using the first person. But anyway, but that's increasing how people would go to country stores to buy those kind of things that made life better, but you didn't have to live. Patent medicines were increasingly popular. People did have all kinds of aches and pains, and for better or worse, this is before the early 20th century, when during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, we had the Pure Food and Drug Act, where you had to put on the labels of things that what was in them, and you also had to have claims for medication proven. So back then, they weren't really patented. They called them patent medicines. That just means it had a proprietary secret formula. They didn't usually take out patents on them, but that's what they called proprietary medicines. Some made right here in Worcester, like Phelps Arcanum, there in the middle, made in Worcester itself. Dr. William Moore's celebrated Essence of Life, and we had Sans Sarsaparilla, which cured all sorts of things. Not to be untowards, but you can see on the upper right there, the sarsaparilla. Sarsaparilla was used to treat a lot of maladies, including venereal diseases. In old Western movies, that's the gag when the tenderfoot walks into the bar, orders sarsaparilla instead of whiskey, and everybody laughs at him. The reason they're laughing isn't because he doesn't drink hard liquor. The reason he's laughing is he's been visiting Miss Kitty upstairs and now needs the medicine for what he got from Miss Kitty. So, and so there was no restriction. You could buy over the counter all kinds of opiates and cocaine. Coca-Cola, before 1906, had cocaine in it. When they didn't let you put cocaine in Coca-Cola anymore, they substituted caffeine, which is still, you know, somewhat of a drug. But you could get all kinds of things like laudanum and paregoric, which are different tinctures of opium dissolved in alcohol, and including teething medicine. You know, kids had sore gums. Put a little alcohol and opium on their gums, and they're quite a little happy. They don't cry so much anymore. And all kinds of medicines that may or may not treat what you wanted to have. Asiatic cholera drops. Asiatic cholera is a bacterial parasite that basically gives you terrible diarrhea and vomiting and dehydrates you to death if you don't treat it with antibiotics. They didn't have antibiotics, but here we got Asiatic cholera drops. Here, take this, you'll feel better. And we got Payne's toothache drops and cough syrup and all kinds of other things with who knows what's in it. Pine tree tar cordial. That sounds what I want to treat. Yep. But anyway, dyspepsia. That wouldn't give you dyspepsia, I think. But anyway, but above all else, country stores were fabric stores. We've studied the inventories of country stores in the early 19th century, and more than anything else, more than half of their inventory is tied up in fabric, thread, needles, pins, buttons, yarn, ribbons, that kind of thing. Industrial Revolution starts in England in the 1770s, 1780s, but even before that, Americans were buying a lot of fabric. In the 1760s, one of the big things that leads the American Revolution is the non-importation agreements that patriots come to. And basically they're going to say, we don't like what England's doing, so we're not going to buy what we're buying from them, including a whole lot of handmade but mass-produced cloth. In the 1760s and 1770s, there was I'm going to forget his name, but there was a doctor here in Leicester that also was a woodworker, and he made spinning wheels. And I've looked at his account books that survive. They're now at the research library at Old Sturbridge Village. And by the early 1770s, he was making like 5 times as many spinning wheels as he'd been making 10 years before Americans said, we should make our own cloth instead of buying it from England. So even before it was mechanized, cloth was a big thing for stores to sell, with bolts and bolts on the walls. This slide is also good to see that one of the big differences, besides lack of brands with these country stores and the stores you and I know, is this idea of a clerk getting you what you want, which still, to a certain extent, fabric stores, they need your help. But here, most everything is behind the counter, and the clerk gets you what you want, shows it to you, see if you want it or not. And they're also making sure you're getting the full measure. Notice this one guy here has scales to measure things. Then, as now, stores have to have their scales, their measures, certified by a local sealer of weights and measures. Like your gas pump even has a little seal on it to make sure you're getting 128 fluid ounces for the, $3 and whatever cents you're paying for it, for your gasoline. But same thing with the scale in the butcher shop when you buy a pound of hamburger, etc. The other reason the storekeepers then needed scales is to make sure that you were giving the right amount of money. It was a matter of, as I said, a very cash-poor society. And so people bought things in a lot of different ways, including foreign money. And you did have translation charts, but you could also just put it on a scale, because legal tender then, money you had to take, was precious metal coin. And so if you wanted to charge somebody a dime, and you had an American dime, 10 cents worth of silver, you put that on one side of a balanced scale, and you put whatever the customer has in silver on the other side until it evens out. That's one way of doing it without getting arithmetic involved. They did have conversion charts, but that involved some arithmetic. But there were a lot of different ways to pay. Like I said, legal tender was hard coin. So if you didn't know somebody, this is what the storekeeper desired. And some storekeepers would put up a sign, they would give discounts for cash, because that way you know what you're getting. And it didn't have to be American money. It could be British money, it could be French money, it could be Spanish money, it could be all kinds of different currency, because it mattered not whose face was on it. And the only face on American money back then was Lady Liberty, sometimes sitting, sometimes standing, sometimes looking young, sometimes not so young, but it was always Lady Liberty as opposed to real people. It wasn't until less than 100 years ago that we were allowed to put named real people on our money. And then they have to be dead. The first person who went from being living to dead on a coin was John Kennedy. The year after he was assassinated, he got on the half dollar, replacing Ben Franklin. But it's always been someone who is dead on American money. And up until the 1930s, it was always somebody who was fictional, or at least symbolic, like Lady Liberty, So anyhow, as opposed to Europeans that always had the king or the queen on the money. And now, that the queen is no longer the queen, and now we got a king. I'm sure Charles is going to show up more and more on British money. But anyway, but there's never enough gold or silver in the world for all the money people want to have. And back then, coin really had precious metal in it. As we learn now, as of yesterday, the federal government stopped making the U.S. cents because it costs, depending on which website you listen to, between 2.7 and 3.7 cents to make a cent, which even with government math doesn't make sense. So anyway, so that's why they stopped. Canada stopped making cent coins years ago. And a lot of other countries got away with smaller denominations because just the worth of it wasn't worth it. But anyway, what most people had in their pockets as cash back then, tangible money, was not these coins, because there wasn't enough gold or silver, even with foreign money, was banknotes. Privately owned, state-chartered banks were allowed to issue paper money. It was as good as the bank that issued it, so you didn't have to take it. But if that's how your boss paid you, you kind of have to take it. If you were a businessman and needed a loan, this is what banks loaned you. They didn't loan you gold or silver. Usually they loaned you money in their notes, and then you use those to buy what you need to run your business. There are also these magazines I have up here. This one by Alpheus Galanis, and this one by Robert Bicknell, Counterfeit Detectors and Expositors, books that were published monthly. By the 1840s, they're published weekly. that have lists of all the banks in the country and how those banks are doing. That bank is out of business. You probably want to try to avoid taking their note if you can help it. And if the bank is shaky, it'll tell you that. You might take it, but you might not accept it at full face value. You might take it at 90 cents on a dollar or less. It would also identify, not by pictures, because they didn't have that technology, but by verbal descriptions of known counterfeit money. So if you had a canal bank that one of the Indians didn't have 7 feathers in the headdress, but only 2, that's a giveaway that might not be a genuine banknote. But that's pretty tricky. When you have 700 banks issuing, each bank maybe 5 or 6 different kind of denominations, you got over 1,000 different banknotes that are in circulation. Do you even know if there's a commercial bank of Buffalo, New York? If you get a note, I don't know. Look in the magazine, see if it's there. Anyway, the way most people paid, though, because most people aren't traveling very far, if a storekeeper gets somebody he doesn't know, he's going to want cash, preferably gold or silver. If not that, a banknote, and he'll probably subscribe to one of these counterfeit detectors to see if it's probably a good banknote or not. But most people that are going to deal with country stores are people that live in the neighborhood. And so he's going to extend them credit. It's called book credit. He assigns a dollars and cents value to all his goods and writes down how many dollars and cents you owe him for the stuff you've bought. And he keeps a running total in what's called a journal or a day book. He just writes down every customer, their name, what they bought, and puts DR, debtor, if they owe him money for it. But he's not just selling things. He's also buying things because people need a way to pay him. So he's buying things that he can make a profit on. Now, a storekeeper today that just gets paid can only make money when he sells things. But storekeepers then could make money when they bought things, because they're buying things that people in the countryside make, and they're going to keep track of it by taking those daily records and then transferring them to an account book or ledger where every customer has a page devoted to their things. And so, like I said, the consumerism drives industry from both ends because the customers need to pay for things. So they make things that they have enough of already. They might make more butter and cheese than they need on their farm, and then sell that to the storekeeper. And then butter and cheese, of course, will keep for months, and then he'll pay them, he'll buy it from them for so many cents a pound and keep a record of it. And then when he goes to Boston to buy these goods from around the world, the rum from the Caribbean, the sugar from the Caribbean, the tools from England, the silks from China, the silks from Italy, which was another big silk producer, wines from France. In Boston, they like butter, they like cheese. The sailors on the ships leaving Boston like butter, like cheese. Not a lot of cows, in downtown Boston. Not a lot of cows on sailing ships. Maybe 1 or 2 they're going to, get milk for a while and then butcher her when they get halfway out in the middle of the ocean. But they'll be able to buy butter and cheese and other things like that. Rags, he's selling rags. There's a younger Kurt Parliament on the right there, if you don't recognize him, selling the storekeeper old rags and a crock of butter. Anyway, the point is that the storekeeper is going to probably offer Kurt a whole lot less than he thinks he'd be able to sell it in Boston for. Now, Kurt doesn't have to sell it to him, so he's going to get the best price he can. But the storekeeper's hoping to make a profit on it, so that when he sells it in Boston, he's making money too. So doing business with the customers this way, having a two-way street, makes it so that the storekeepers are doubling their chance of making a profit. But it also gives the country people a way to pay for all this stuff from all over the world. And so, like I was saying before, with shoes, Massachusetts was a huge shoe producer. Massachusetts, by 1830, was making over 15.5 million pairs of shoes and boots a year. Just Massachusetts. The United States did not have 13 million people in it yet. The federal census of 1830 was like 12,900,000 and something people. So the country didn't have 13 million people, but this one state was making 15.5 million pairs of shoes and boots. But they're doing that by splitting it up into a whole bunch of hand steps, with one person doing one step, one person doing another step. And so women in their houses were paid a few cents a piece to just take pre-cut piece of leather and sew them together for the upper parts of shoes, and then have men being paid in shops to put the soles on. But women would also do things like knit and knit mittens and sell mittens to the storekeeper, besides making butter and making cheese. It's called the putting out system, this cottage industry of making things for people you're not going to, or even doing part of the step of making things for people you're never going to meet. Sometimes braiding straw, putting some rye in your field, and before it got to be a seed that you could harvest, when it's still halfway green and the stalks are flexible, cutting that rye and taking those stalks and braiding it into hats. Or buying palm leaf from the storekeeper and weaving palm leaf from Cuba into hats that you then sell back to the storekeeper. And these goods are being shipped around. This is from a few towns away in Brimfield, but you see this freight wagon with goods from around the world coming to the town, but also you'd see barrels of butter, wheels of cheese being shipped off to Boston. So there are some differences, I'm saying, as I mentioned, between stores now and stores then. And as I mentioned, take a look at this. What makes this a modern store? Can you tell me what makes it a modern store in some ways? I mean modern in the grand sense. I realize this is not the Walmart down the road on Route 9, but how's it different than, what's that sign on the counter? It's a brand. We sell copper plug tobacco, not just try it. It's brands. They didn't have brands in early stores. That's one thing that makes this modern. It's got brands of stuff. It's also got a lady working behind the counter. One of the things that's different with early stores and stores today is caused by World War I. In World War I, millions of American men, many of whom would be working in stores, signed up to put the kibosh on the Kaiser. So there's a big manpower shortage. And the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, that became A&P Supermarkets, had problems. They couldn't hire enough young store clerks to stand behind the counter and get you everything you wanted. So they decided to just put prices on the stuff and put it in front of the counters instead of behind the counters, where you had to ask the storekeeper for it. And then they'd hire one or two guys to run the cash register and to stock the shelves, but they weren't going to get everything for everybody. Not only did they save money on labor, which they kind of expected because they couldn't hire enough people to begin with, but they started making a whole lot more money because when people could grab the stuff themselves, they bought a whole lot more stuff. You all know when you go to the store to buy milk, where's the milk? As far from the front door as they can put it, right? Every store, if you're looking for milk, go as far from the door and you'll find the milk, right? And on the way, you see, oh, look, they have a sale on cereal. Oh, look, I'm hungry. I'm going to buy some cookies. Oh, look, whatever. I'm out of laundry detergent. I forgot. I sometimes forget to get the milk because I've got my arms full of stuff, and I do. But anyway, but that's because in 1913, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company couldn't find enough men to work the store, so they had to put prices on things and let people get it themselves. Look at this with a turnstile. That way you couldn't get out without paying. But isn't that cute? Anyway, but look how people are buying all this stuff they didn't really want. And like I said, the other thing is brand choice. Today, we got thousands of different brands we can get. Not just, okay, you want coffee? We got coffee. You want tea? We got black and green. Pick your flavor. But now 10,000 different brands of everything. And of course, we've got all these other ways to pay. Most of you probably aren't sewing the stores. You don't go to Walmart with a keg of butter and say, okay, how much you give me for the butter, right? That probably wouldn't work. But we've got all sorts of ways that they never thought of. We got coins. Now the federal government prints paper money, so you have a little more uniform paper money. We also not only have credit cards, but we have debit cards, and we have QR codes on our phones. We can swipe this. We got chips. We got all kinds of things, ways to pay. People have figured out, for thousands of years, people have figured out the easier it is for you to pay for something, the more likely you are to buy something. And so that's why they come up with all these conveniences to make it easier for us to pay, because that makes it easier for us to spend. And what's the first thing they tell people when they get too much credit card debt? Cut out your credit cards, right? Because the easier it is to pay for something, the more you're going to buy. See the coat behind me? Yeah, so anyway. I was going to wrap up by telling you a little bit about the Ace and Night store at Old Sturbridge Village. Before that store, most of you have been to Old Sturbridge Village, I assume. So I'm going to use that as an example. Before that exhibit, the Ace and Night store, most museum store exhibits didn't look like it looked back in the Ace and Night store in the 1830s. It was like this store, where the curators saw what they had, and they put whatever, one or two musty, dusty, rusty, crusty old things they had in their collection that looked like they were 100, 200 years old, and put it out there and said, see, this is what a store looked like. Would you buy any of that musty, dusty, would you buy any of these drugs here? They don't look appealing. No, they're old and broken and dried up and like those rusty tools behind these young ladies. And of course what Colonial Williamsburg does is they make their gift shops look like oldie stores by putting the cash register behind a wall and making the staff wear oldie-timey clothes and displaying everything where we can get to it, which is a sign of a modern store after World War I, but we don't know that. I went to Williamsburg years and years ago with a friend of mine, and we must have gone through 3 exhibits and 6 gift shops before she said, more than half the places are gift shops, aren't they? I said, yeah. You get fooled there. This is Old Sturbridge Village's first effort at a country store, Grant's General Store. This is 1949 Mercury out front. When they first opened Old Sturbridge Village, let people drive around. If you ever heard the song Mercury Blues, which everybody from Steve Miller to Alan Jackson have covered, it's about a 49 Mercury. This is a 49 Mercury, so I won't sing you the song. Listen to Alan Jackson. I think he's got the best version of Mercury Blues. Hey there, mama, looking real fine, cruising around town in your Mercury 49. She's crazy about a Mercury. I'll recite lyrics, but I try not to sing. But anyway, so at Old Sturbridge Village, they tried to have the Minor Grant store, but it was neither fish or fowl. They put the ladies in oldie-timey clothes and pretended it was like a country store, but it was a country store that sold stuff from like 1700 to 1920. So old, but how old? They also sold modern gift shop stuff. So it was kind of neither one nor the other. So they tried to make it a little more authentic in the 1960s, but they didn't get there. They didn't understand. Anyway, so in the 1970s, Old Sturbridge Village acquired a country store in Dummerston, Vermont, that had been owned and run up until his untimely sudden death in the 1850s by a man named Asa Knight. And this is what the Ace and Night store looked like when it was up in Vermont. The thing in the middle of the photograph is the original store that was built in 1811 by Asa Black. And then Asa Knight built the big store that you see there, that you see at Old Sturbridge Village in 1838. The building on the right is Asa Knight's house, which is almost identical to the Salem Townhouse at Old Sturbridge Village. Anyway, we were able to acquire it at Old Sturbridge Village and moved it to Sturbridge, where you've seen it now. This is Asa Knight there on the right, and when he had his portrait painted, he had because he's a merchant, he's got his books in his hands, and on the table behind him, the arrow points to his ledger and his journal. We actually have those books in our research library now, which is really cool to have his painting with his books and then have the books. And there's his wife, Susan Moore Knight, and there's their son, Asa Randolph Knight. By the time Asa Judge Knight, he was a probate court judge for 2 years, but he always insisted, after that, they call him Judge Knight, because they love titles that you earned. Hate titles you were born into, like King, Duke, but you earned it, you kept it forever. You got elected militia captain for a year or two, rest of your life, everybody called you captain. Unless you got promoted and they called you major or colonel. But anyway, the point is that we actually have those journals, as I showed you, in our library. There they are, in their rusty glory. Anyway, that original store there, that little L, built by Asa Black around 1810, 1811 or so. And there it is. I can tell it's before 1909 The reason is because in 1909, the people that were living in that house, Asa Knight died in the 1850s. His son tried to run the store. It went out of business in the 1860s, and then was vacant for over a century, which is kind of cool. So it got well preserved, is what I'm saying. But in 1909, they tore down the original little store and moved it and made it on the back of the house so they could drive their car around between the house and the store and park it in the basement of the store. And that's a little after they've torn it down. So there it is in 1967 with the, that original part gone. And there's this growth pattern to phase one. And then Ace Knight bought it in 1826 and put a little addition on it, and business was really good. So then he really built it up. And then in 1909, it was an empty store that they just had there, and the original one was in the way, so they cut it off and drove their car and parked it in the basement. I'm not going to torture you with these slides, but you can see in the attic how the where that store had been that they cut off and just put boards on the wall to keep the weather out, and how they joined additions on. But that's how it looked when we got it. It had been vacant for over 100 years, but still some merchandise still there after over a century unsold, and the auction to sell off what they had sold. And even where things were missing, like on the left, some of the shelves have already been taken out, but you can still see the shadows on the walls, the stain on the walls from where they were. So it's really easy for the museum to restore it, even in its rough condition. And that's the basement where they had wagons, and like I said, they parked the car. Anyhow, look at the wear on the floor where the knots were. People just sort of shuffling along. And so we did archaeology at the store. Deb, I know, knows the lady on the right. That's Caroline Sloat when she was like quite younger. Yeah, when she was 12, yes. Anyway, so they're digging where the original Asa Black store had been, where it had been the one torn down in 1909. And then in 1972, they took it apart in Vermont and brought it back to Sturbridge and started putting it back together. And there it is now. And then restoring the paint to look at new, looking at the historical record to figure out what we should have on the shelves, not just of his store, but other stores in New England in the early 19th century, looking at their inventories. And then we collected hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of goods that were sold in stores to see what the label should look like, what the packaging should look like. But instead of putting the rusty, dusty, musty old one out, we made copies, so they looked brand new and unsold. This is matches that were made in West Boylston by a guy named Pearson Cowie, and he called them superchlorate matches, or lucifers. Lucifer was actually a brand name for a friction match. Lucifer, of course, is the angel who fell from grace and got called Satan afterwards. But Lucifer means light bearer, a good name for a match. So, but Pearson Cowie was in Boylston, so that's why it's kind of cool. And our Cooper shop made barrels. We made them look right. Got the right kind of fabric on the shelves. All kind of tools reproduced, and ceramics reproduced, and more goods reproduced. So it looks like a fully stocked, appealing new store. So if Asa Knight went in there, he'd say, "What's she doing behind the counter?" But except for her, it looks like, I think it would look like he had it. See the labels on the drawers? We've refreshed those labels, but the drawers still have their labels on them, so we knew what to put where. So it was kind of cool, so that we could do it. But stores were used to like I said, be community places, because storekeepers then knew what storekeepers now know. The longer you can keep people in the store, the more they'll buy. Even if it's just guys hanging around playing checkers, reading the paper, they realize it's late, and they realize that they got some explaining to do to their wife, but if they buy her some ribbon, maybe they won't be as mad at him when he gets home. So storekeepers knew that then, as they know it now. Anyway, I've gone on at you for just over an hour now, so that's probably enough. I apologize for being loquacious, but if you have comments, questions, complaints, I can try to address them. But nope, you're afraid I'll talk more. Okay, well, there we go. I thank you for coming out on this dreary, wet, cold night, but yeah, my pleasure. Thanks very much. Thanks very much.